The courtroom was packed, the air so tense it felt like a storm was about to break. Lawyers shuffled papers, journalists whispered to one another, and the crowd leaned forward in their seats, waiting for the scandal everyone in New York had been talking about. At the center of it all sat Claire Bennett, a young attorney whose hands rested protectively over her swollen belly. Her face was pale but composed, the quiet strength of a woman who had already endured more pain than anyone could imagine. Across from her, Vanessa Monroe lounged with a smirk, her designer dress gleaming under the bright lights. She wasn't just David Carter's mistress, she was his weapon, a woman who thrived on humiliating Claire. And today, in front of an audience that included reporters and curious onlookers, she was about to go too far. The judge entered the room, his black robe flowing behind him. He was stern, unreadable, and no one in the room knew the secret that tied him to Claire. For now, he was just Judge William Carter, the man appointed to oversee a bitter divorce case. As the proceedings began, whispers filled the gallery. David sat coldly at Vanessa's side, refusing to even glance at the woman carrying his child. The betrayal was complete, and everyone could see it. Claire, despite the pain tearing through her, kept her head high. She believed that dignity was her last defense. Then it happened. Vanessa leaned forward, her voice dripping with venom as she mocked Claire's pregnancy, questioning whether David should even be responsible for the child. Gasps filled the room, but before anyone could react, Vanessa's hand flew across the table. The sharp crack of the slap echoed through the courtroom, stunning everyone into silence. Claire staggered, her hand instinctively clutching her stomach as tears welled in her eyes. The bailiff froze, unsure if he should intervene. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. Phones lifted into the air as people recorded the scandal, the slap already destined to go viral within minutes. Claire's face burned, her heart raced, and for the first time, she looked as if she might break. But the most shocking part had yet to come. Because the judge sitting above them, the man who seemed like just another cold authority figure, was not just the arbiter of justice in this trial. He was her father. And as his knuckles whitened around the gavel, the truth simmered beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to explode. What no one knew was that the slap was only the beginning, and the judge's hidden connection to Claire would change everything. Before the world saw her as the pregnant woman humiliated in a courtroom, Claire Bennett had been a symbol of quiet determination. Born and raised in New Jersey, she wasn't handed privilege on a silver platter. She fought her way through law school, taking night classes while working full-time at a small firm. Her colleagues admired her discipline, but what truly defined Claire was her heart. She believed in fairness, in helping those who couldn't defend themselves, and in love. Perhaps too much in love. When she met David Carter, he seemed like a dream. Charming, wealthy, and ambitious, David swept her off her feet. Friends warned her that he was too smooth, too practiced with his words, but Claire chose to believe in the man behind the polished smile. Against all odds, they married. For a while, life seemed perfect. They had a beautiful apartment in Manhattan, dinners under soft city lights, and endless promises about the future. Then came the happiest news of her life. She was pregnant. Claire imagined a family where love would thrive, where her child would grow up in warmth and stability. She decorated a small room in their home, folding tiny clothes with trembling hands, already envisioning the laughter that would fill the space. For the first time in years, she let herself feel safe. But safety, as Claire would discover, was an illusion. Slowly, David changed. He grew distant, spending late nights at the office. He ignored her texts, dismissed her questions, and when he did come home, he smelled of expensive perfume that wasn't hers. The truth arrived in brutal fragments. Whispers from acquaintances, receipts left carelessly in pockets, and finally, Vanessa Monroe. Vanessa was everything Claire wasn't. Bold, flashy, and unafraid of cruelty. Where Claire was modest, Vanessa flaunted. Where Claire sought respect, Vanessa craved dominance. And David, blinded by vanity and temptation, fell willingly into her trap. The betrayal shattered Claire, but she never showed it in public. She carried her pain silently, protecting her unborn child from stress. She told herself that dignity mattered, that her baby deserved a mother who stood tall even when her world was crumbling. Nights alone, however, she cried into her pillow, whispering apologies to the life growing inside her. Apologies for choosing the wrong man. And so, when the divorce papers came, Claire didn't fight them. She believed her silence was strength, but in reality, she was walking into the lion's den, where Vanessa's cruelty and David's coldness would be displayed for everyone to see. The courtroom wasn't just about property or custody. It was about humiliation, reputation, and the stripping away of Claire's last defenses. Yet even in her most fragile state, Claire's story was far from over. Because hidden in the shadows of the courtroom sat one man whose heart still beat for her, a man who had more power than anyone else in the room. What Claire didn't know was that her greatest ally was sitting on the judge's bench, silently watching and waiting. Before betrayal poisoned her life, Claire Bennett had once lived in what seemed like a fairy tale. When she first married David Carter, her days were filled with moments that felt too good to be real. They spent weekends walking through Central Park, sipping hot chocolate in winter, or riding bicycles under the summer sun. David, always polished and confident, held her hand with the ease of a man who seemed devoted. To the outside world, they were the perfect couple. A rising attorney and a successful businessman building a life together in Manhattan. Their apartment on the Upper East Side was filled with light, laughter, and dreams. Claire decorated it with simple touches, a vase of fresh flowers on the dining table, family photos lining the hallway, and stacks of her law books scattered across the living room. David often teased her about working too much, but she loved that he pretended to care. She believed they were building something lasting, a foundation that could weather anything. On their second anniversary, David surprised her with a weekend getaway to Napa Valley. Claire remembered the vineyard's golden sunsets, the clinking of glasses, and the whispered promises David made beneath the stars. He told her they would grow old together, that she was his forever. Claire believed him. She had no reason not to. When she found out she was pregnant, her joy overflowed. She shared the news with David one quiet evening after dinner, handing him a tiny pair of baby shoes she had bought in secret. For a moment, his eyes softened. He hugged her, kissed her forehead, and told her he was ready to be a father. Claire's heart swelled with hope. She began to imagine a nursery, family holidays, and bedtime stories. But looking back, the cracks had already begun to show. David's phone calls that ended abruptly, his vague explanations for late nights at the office, his sudden disinterest in family conversations, all were warning signs Claire ignored. She thought he was just stressed, that work demanded too much of him. She told herself love required patience, that once the baby arrived, everything would settle. She smiled through loneliness, held on to promises that faded like smoke, and clung to the image of the man she had married. Even when she found a lipstick stain on his collar, she convinced herself it was a misunderstanding. After all, David had sworn loyalty to her. He was her husband, the father of her child. But the truth was waiting in the shadows, and the fairy tale was already unraveling. Claire had no idea that the woman who would destroy her marriage was not only in David's life, but was preparing to step boldly into her own. The perfect world Claire thought she had built was about to collapse, and the face of betrayal would soon reveal itself. Vanessa Monroe did not enter Claire Bennett's life quietly. She stormed into it, bold and unapologetic, like a woman who believed the world owed her everything. Where Claire carried herself with modest grace, Vanessa radiated arrogance. She wore the kind of clothes that announced her presence before she spoke. Designer dresses that clung tightly, heels that clicked like a drumbeat of defiance. And when she finally revealed herself, she didn't do it in secret shadows. She did it publicly, with venom. Claire's first encounter with Vanessa wasn't in a whispered rumor or an anonymous text. It was at a charity gala, one Claire had attended with David, glowing with the pride of an expectant mother. She remembered adjusting her dress to cover her growing belly, smiling at guests, and believing that the man by her side was still hers. Then Vanessa appeared. She was stunning, of course, long dark hair cascading over her shoulders, eyes that sparkled with mischief, and lips curved in a smile that didn't hide its cruelty. She walked straight to David, touched his arm as though she had every right, and looked Claire up and down with a smirk. "David," Vanessa purred, "aren't you going to introduce me?" Claire froze, her pulse hammering in her ears. David hesitated for a second, then gave the introduction no wife ever wants to hear. "Claire, this is Vanessa, a friend from work." But Vanessa wasn't interested in playing subtle. Leaning closer, she whispered just loud enough for Claire to hear. "Not just a friend." The words cut sharper than any blade. Claire tried to hold herself together, her smile trembling as she excused herself to the restroom. She locked the door and pressed a hand over her stomach, whispering to her unborn child that everything would be okay. But deep down, she knew something had shattered. From that night on, Vanessa no longer stayed in the shadows. She called David during dinners, sent him gifts brazenly wrapped in gold ribbon, and even posted cryptic photos on social media that hinted at their relationship. Every move was calculated, designed to humiliate Claire and force her into silence. People began to whisper. Friends who once praised Claire's perfect marriage now looked at her with pity. Colleagues exchanged glances, wondering how the strong attorney had lost control of her own home. And through it all, Vanessa thrived. She fed on Claire's pain, twisting the knife deeper every chance she got. David, weak and intoxicated by Vanessa's boldness, allowed it. He stopped hiding. He no longer cared who saw him with her, no longer respected the vows he had once sworn. For Claire, every day became a battlefield. Every glance from Vanessa, a reminder that her life was unraveling. But what she didn't know yet was that Vanessa's cruelty was only beginning, and soon it would reach a stage so public that no one could ignore it. The mistress wasn't satisfied with stealing Claire's husband. She wanted to destroy her completely, and the next strike would happen in the most humiliating place of all. Pregnancy was supposed to be the safest, most beautiful chapter of Claire Bennett's life. She dreamed of soft lullabies, late-night cravings that made her laugh, and tender conversations with David about baby names. But instead of love and security, she found herself living in a nightmare, one discovery at a time. It began with small cracks in the illusion. David started coming home late, offering excuses that felt rehearsed. "The office is drowning in work," he'd mutter, loosening his tie as he poured himself a drink. Claire wanted to believe him. She told herself stress could change a man, that the father of her child wouldn't betray her. But the doubts refused to stay buried. One evening, she stumbled upon the truth in the most painful way. While doing laundry, she pulled a crisp white shirt from David's suitcase. At first, she thought nothing of it, until her eyes landed on the faint trace of lipstick smeared on the collar. Not her shade, not her mark. Her heart dropped. She clutched the shirt as tears blurred her vision. For the sake of her baby, she bit her tongue and pretended not to notice. But inside, something cracked. Days later, the cracks widened. A hotel receipt fell from David's jacket pocket. The date matched a night he had told her he was working late. The charges were for champagne, a suite, and luxury spa services. Claire stood frozen in the kitchen, staring at the slip of paper as if it were a death sentence. Her worst fears were confirmed when she saw a message flash on David's phone while he showered. It was from Vanessa. "Last night was unforgettable. Can't wait for round 2. Claire's trembling hands nearly dropped the phone. Her stomach twisted, not from pregnancy, but from betrayal so raw it stole her breath. That night, Claire sat alone in the nursery, surrounded by unopened boxes of baby furniture. She ran her hand over the soft fabric of a crib blanket and whispered to her unborn child, "I'm sorry. I didn't know your father would be this man, but I promise, I will protect you." Her tears soaked the tiny blanket, a silent vow born out of heartbreak. David, meanwhile, showed no remorse. He grew colder, more distant, and when Claire finally confronted him, his response was a dagger to her chest. "You're imagining things. Don't make a scene, Claire. You're too emotional because of the pregnancy." His gaslighting cut deeper than the lies themselves. But Claire wasn't imagining. The lipstick, the receipts, the messages, everything screamed the truth. The man she had trusted with her future was no longer hers. Still, she swallowed her pain. For her child, she chose silence. She carried the burden alone, walking through her days with a smile that hid the storm inside her. But the storm was only growing stronger, and soon it would break in front of everyone. Claire thought she had seen the worst of David's betrayal, but the humiliation waiting for her in public would tear her world apart. Claire Bennett had always been known for her composure. Even in law school, when exams piled up and classmates crumbled under pressure, she carried herself with quiet strength. But nothing had prepared her for the silent war she now faced inside her own marriage. Pregnant, betrayed, and humiliated, she endured every wound in silence, because her child's well-being mattered more than her own broken heart. Her days became a performance. Each morning, she rose from bed, fixed her hair, and smiled at the world as though nothing was wrong. At work, she buried herself in case files, convincing her colleagues she was fine. When asked about David, she forced a practiced grin and replied, "He's busy, but we're doing well." Lies slipped from her lips with ease, not because she wanted to deceive, but because she couldn't bear to let the world see her shame. Nights, however, were different. Alone in their Manhattan apartment, she curled up on the couch with her hands over her stomach, whispering to her unborn baby. She told stories about the future, about birthdays and family vacations, about laughter that would one day fill their empty home. Her voice trembled, but she forced hope into every word. The loneliness was unbearable. Claire longed for a partner's touch, for David to sit beside her and marvel at the tiny kicks she felt beneath her skin. Instead, she often woke to find his side of the bed cold, his phone buzzing with messages he refused to explain. The sound of his laughter, muffled behind closed doors as he whispered to Vanessa, became knives twisting into her soul. Worse than the betrayal was the isolation. Claire's pride kept her from confiding in friends or family. She couldn't bear the pitying stares, the whispered judgments. She told herself that enduring in silence was strength, but deep down she was crumbling. The stress gnawed at her body, leaving her exhausted, her face pale, her heart heavy with fear. One evening, as she folded baby clothes in the nursery, she caught her reflection in the mirror. Dark circles under her eyes, shoulders slumped, smile faded. She hardly recognized herself. For a moment, despair consumed her. She pressed her face into the soft fabric of a onesie and sobbed, her tears soaking the tiny garment. "I have to be strong for you," she whispered to her baby, "even if it kills me inside." Every sacrifice she made was for her child. Every silence she kept was for the fragile life growing within her. Yet, the weight of unspoken pain was crushing her, threatening to break the very strength she clung to. Still, Claire endured. She chose dignity over revenge, restraint over rage. But the walls she had built around her pain were not unshakable. And when the betrayal finally spilled into the public eye, those walls would shatter in front of everyone. The day was coming when Claire's silent suffering would no longer stay hidden, and the world would witness her humiliation firsthand. The papers arrived one gray morning, delivered by a stern-faced courier who refused to meet Claire's eyes. She opened the envelope with trembling hands, and there it was in black and white. David had filed for divorce. The man who had once promised her forever now sought to erase her, to strip her of the life they had built together. And the cruelest detail of all? His petition requested sole control of their assets, leaving Claire with nothing but her unborn child. Claire sat at the kitchen table, her hand resting protectively on her belly. She wanted to scream, to tear the papers apart, but she couldn't risk stressing the baby. Instead, she folded the documents neatly, as if order could somehow tame the chaos inside her. When she confronted David, his coldness chilled her more than the betrayal itself. He stood in their living room, arms crossed, eyes void of emotion. "It's better this way," he said flatly. "You'll get a settlement. Don't drag this out, Claire. It'll only make you look pathetic." Her voice broke as she asked, "After everything, after our child, this is what you want?" But David didn't even flinch. "Vanessa makes me happy. You don't anymore." The words shattered what little strength she had left. And as if twisting the knife deeper, Vanessa herself appeared days later, strutting into the apartment Claire once called home. She wore a smug smile, her arm linked with David's, as though she were already the rightful wife. "Don't take it personally, Claire," Vanessa sneered. "Some women just aren't meant to keep a man like David." The humiliation was unbearable, yet Claire swallowed her pride, retreating into silence once again. She told herself the courtroom would be her chance to finally defend her dignity, to stand for herself and her child. She began gathering what little evidence she had, receipts, messages, small fragments of truth. But Vanessa was already ahead of her. she paraded around town on David's arm, attending parties, posing for photographs, letting everyone know she had won. The gossip columns buzzed with speculation, painting Claire as the bitter, discarded wife, while Vanessa basked in the role of the victorious mistress. The night before the hearing, Claire sat alone in her apartment. She held her baby's ultrasound picture in her hands, her tears falling onto the glossy paper. "I will fight for us," she whispered. "Even if I have nothing left, I will fight." Outside, the city lights glittered, indifferent to her pain. Somewhere across town, Vanessa and David celebrated, sipping champagne, laughing at Claire's supposed weakness. They thought they had already crushed her spirit, but the courtroom had its own rules, and not everything was as it seemed. Neither David nor Vanessa knew that the judge presiding over the case carried a secret that would soon turn their triumph into devastation. The day of the hearing arrived, and the courthouse in downtown Manhattan buzzed like a hive. Crowds gathered outside, journalists elbowing one another for the best spot as cameras flashed and microphones were thrust forward. The story of David Carter, his pregnant wife Claire Bennett, and the glamorous mistress Vanessa Monroe had already become a headline in every major paper. By the time Claire stepped out of the cab, the scandal had reached millions of eyes and ears. Reporters shouted her name. "Claire, how does it feel to be abandoned during pregnancy? Do you think David will win custody of the assets? Are you ready to face Vanessa in court?" Each question felt like an arrow, sharp and merciless. Claire kept her head down, clutching her coat around her belly, shielding herself from the storm of attention. Inside, the atmosphere was no less suffocating. The gallery was filled with curious onlookers, some sympathetic, others eager to watch a woman's downfall. Family members of David had taken their seats, their cold expressions silently condemning Claire. Vanessa, on the other hand, thrived on the attention. She strutted through the courthouse like a celebrity, her heels echoing with confidence, her lips curved in a smile that dared anyone to question her place beside David. David himself looked polished, his tailored suit perfectly pressed, his gaze fixed forward as though he were the victim. He whispered to Vanessa, who laughed softly, ensuring Claire could see every moment of their intimacy. The display was deliberate, a performance designed to break her before the trial even began. Claire sat quietly at her table, her attorney murmuring strategy in her ear. But her mind was elsewhere. She could feel the eyes of the room drilling into her, measuring her strength, searching for cracks. She rubbed her stomach gently, grounding herself in the life she carried. "For you," she whispered under her breath. "I'll survive this for you." The tension rose when the media was allowed inside. Photographers clicked relentlessly, capturing every flicker of emotion. Claire forced herself to sit tall, though inside she trembled. The humiliation of having her private pain dissected by strangers was unbearable. Every whisper, every camera flash, reminded her that this was more than a divorce. It was a public spectacle. Then the bailiff called for silence. The heavy doors opened and the judge entered. The room fell still, a hush sweeping across the crowd as Judge William Carter took his seat on the bench. His expression was unreadable, his gavel striking with authority. To everyone else, he was simply the figure of justice. But to Claire, he was something far more. A father she hadn't seen in years. A man who carried his own guilt and secrets. Their eyes met for the briefest second, and in that moment, Claire felt both a flicker of hope and a wave of dread. The trial was about to begin, and no one in the room knew the explosive truth about the judge's connection to the woman they were all ready to condemn. The courtroom was already thick with tension, every breath held as testimony began. Claire Bennett sat quietly at her table, her attorney presenting arguments with calm precision. She listened, her hands resting protectively on her belly, while the judge, her father, remained composed and distant, careful not to betray even a flicker of recognition. Across the aisle, Vanessa Monroe shifted in her chair, visibly restless. The attention from the cameras wasn't enough for her. She wanted more. She wanted domination. She wanted to humiliate Claire, not only through the trial, but in a moment so brutal that no one would ever forget it. As the attorney for David finished outlining his claims, painting Claire as unstable, too emotional, and unfit to manage their shared wealth, Vanessa leaned toward David and whispered something that made him smirk. Then she stood abruptly, ignoring the judge's warning glare. "Your Honor," Vanessa's voice rang out, dripping with venom. "Why are we even pretending? This woman is pathetic. Look at her, crying, hiding behind her pregnancy as if that excuses her weakness. David deserves better than this." The courtroom gasped. Claire's eyes widened, her lips trembling as she fought to stay composed. The judge's gavel struck sharply. "Miss Monroe, sit down. This is not your place to speak." But Vanessa didn't care. She strutted toward Claire's table, every heel strike echoing like a countdown. "You think carrying his child makes you special?" she sneered. "You're nothing but a burden. You couldn't keep him satisfied, and that's why he came to me." Claire's heart pounded, her face burning with shame as the entire courtroom watched. Her attorney tried to block Vanessa's advance, but before anyone could stop her, Vanessa's hand shot out. The sound of the slap cracked through the courtroom like thunder. Claire's head jerked to the side, her cheek flaming red as gasps erupted around the room. Instinctively, she clutched her stomach, tears springing to her eyes. Chaos followed. The bailiff rushed forward, cameras clicked wildly, and reporters scrambled to capture the scandalous moment. Claire sat frozen, trembling, her humiliation complete. For the first time, she looked as though she might shatter in front of everyone. David didn't move to help her. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. Vanessa stood over Claire, triumphant, her voice dripping with cruelty. "See, even your dignity is gone. You don't deserve him. You don't deserve anything." The gallery buzzed with whispers, some horrified, others feeding off the spectacle. Claire's world spun, her vision blurred with tears. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but fear for her child held her in place. On the bench, Judge William Carter's hand tightened around his gavel until his knuckles turned white. His mask of neutrality cracked for just a second, his jaw clenched with fury, but he said nothing. For now. What no one realized was that the slap was only the spark. The explosion that would follow would tear open secrets powerful enough to change everything. The echo of Vanessa Monroe's slap still hung in the air like a gunshot. For a moment, the entire courtroom froze. No one moved, no one breathed. The sound of Claire Bennett's muffled gasp was the only thing breaking the silence as her hand clutched her belly, her eyes wide with both pain and fear. Then, chaos erupted. Reporters scrambled to their feet, cameras flashing furiously to capture the image of the humiliated pregnant wife. Gasps rippled through the gallery, followed by a wave of whispers that grew into a roar of scandal. Did she just hit her? Oh my God, on camera! This will be everywhere by tonight. Claire sat motionless, her cheek burning where Vanessa's hand had struck. She blinked back tears, refusing to let them fall in front of the crowd. Inside, though, her heart was breaking. She wasn't just a woman betrayed. She was a mother terrified for the safety of her unborn child. Her attorney leapt up, shouting for order. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. My client has been physically assaulted in open court." The bailiff hurried forward, grabbing Vanessa by the arm. But Vanessa only laughed, tossing her hair as if she had just won a prize fight. "What?" Someone had to put her in her place. Her voice dripped with arrogance, feeding the frenzy of onlookers. David Carter remained in his chair, cold and unmoving. He didn't flinch, didn't rise to defend his wife or even to calm his mistress. Instead, he leaned back, watching with detached amusement, as if the slap had been nothing more than a scene in a play he directed. His silence cut deeper than Vanessa's hand ever could. The judge's gavel slammed against the bench. "Order!" Judge William Carter's voice thundered through the chamber, but his eyes betrayed a storm raging inside. His daughter had just been struck before his very eyes, and yet he was bound by the robes he wore, forced to maintain the illusion of impartiality. Claire's breathing quickened. She pressed her hand firmly against her stomach, whispering under her breath, "Please stay safe. Please don't let this hurt you." For her child, she would endure anything. But the sting of Vanessa's hand, the weight of David's silence, and the cruelty of the public gaze felt unbearable. The gallery erupted again, some voices condemning Vanessa, others whispering that perhaps Claire had deserved it. The cruelty of strangers stung as much as the betrayal of loved ones. Claire lowered her eyes, her dignity crumbling under the weight of humiliation. Yet through the chaos, one truth became clear. The slap had changed everything. No longer was this just a divorce case. It had become a public spectacle, a war of character and reputation. And somewhere beneath the gavel, behind the mask of the judge, a father's fury was quietly building. The courtroom thought they had witnessed the peak of scandal, but the storm about to break would make the SLAP look like nothing at all. Behind the polished mahogany bench, Judge William Carter sat rigid, his gavel still trembling from the force of his last strike. His face remained a mask of authority, but beneath that mask raged a storm no one in the courtroom could see. The woman who had just been slapped was not merely another plaintiff in a messy divorce case. She was his daughter, his flesh and blood, humiliated before the world while he was sworn to silence. Every instinct in him screamed to rise, to step down from the bench and shield her, to wrap her in the protection only a father could give. But his black robe was both his shield and his chain. The law demanded impartiality. To reveal the truth now would destroy the trial, ruin his career, and possibly invalidate everything that was about to happen. Yet as he looked at Claire, sitting small and fragile at her table, her hand pressed against the swell of her stomach, his heart ached with unbearable guilt. He had not been present in her life for years. Choices, regrets, and distance had carved a canyon between them. And now, the first time their lives intersected so publicly, he was forced to watch her be struck like prey before a pack of wolves. The gallery buzzed with whispers. Vanessa Monroe smirked, reveling in the chaos she had created. David sat smugly beside her, utterly unashamed. Their arrogance boiled William's blood. He clenched his fists beneath the bench, his jaw tight, every muscle straining to hold back the fury inside him. He glanced at Claire again. For just a second, their eyes met. Her gaze was broken, yet somewhere deep inside, there was still a flicker of strength. That flicker was what kept William from shattering his role in that very moment. He had to protect her, not with rage, but with justice. Justice that would be colder, sharper, and more devastating than any slap. "Miss Monroe," his voice rang out, steady though his chest thundered. "One more outburst, and you will be held in contempt." Vanessa rolled her eyes, but returned to her seat, whispering something into David's ear that made him smirk. The sight was almost too much for William to endure. His hand hovered over the gavel, not as a judge, but as a father barely restrained. He forced himself back into control, reminding himself that patience was his weapon. The trial was only beginning. Evidence had yet to be presented. And when the truth came to light, it would not be a mistress's slap or a husband's betrayal that defined the day. It would be the judgment of the court. His judgment. But even as he told himself this, William knew something with chilling certainty. He would not allow them to destroy Claire. Not as a judge, not as a father. The fury he buried beneath the black robe was waiting to erupt, and when it did, it would turn the entire trial upside down. The courtroom returned to order, but inside Claire Bennett, there was no calm. Her cheek still stung from Vanessa's hand, but the pain was nothing compared to the humiliation pressing down on her chest. She sat rigid, hands trembling as she gripped the table, trying to steady her breathing. Every eye in the room was on her. Every camera lens was capturing her weakness. She wanted to disappear. She wanted the floor beneath her to open and swallow her whole. For a fleeting moment, she even wished she could run out of the courtroom, escape the suffocating glares and hide where no one could reach her. But her hand drifted to her stomach, and the tiny flutter of life within reminded her why she could not leave. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for her child. Still, the weight was unbearable. Every whisper in the gallery cut into her like a blade. Pathetic. No wonder he left her. She looks broken. Claire heard it all, whether the words were spoken aloud or only written across judgmental faces. Her pride, her dignity, the very core of her identity seemed to crumble under the pressure. Her attorney leaned close, whispering reassurance. "Stay strong. This isn't over. The evidence is on our side." But Claire barely heard him. Her ears rang, her vision blurred, and her heartbeat thundered like a drum. The stress, the betrayal, the public shaming, it was all too much. In that dizzy moment, she thought about the past year. The joy of discovering her pregnancy, the heartbreak of uncovering David's betrayal, the sleepless nights of silent suffering, and now, the cruel slap that had played out in front of strangers. She felt stripped bare, like her life had been torn apart for everyone's entertainment. Her throat tightened, tears welled in her eyes, and she fought desperately to hold them back. She knew the cameras were waiting for the moment she broke, the moment the strong attorney became nothing more than a shattered wife. But the tears betrayed her. One slipped down her cheek, glistening under the harsh courtroom lights. Vanessa saw it and smiled. A slow, cruel smile that told Claire she had won. David leaned toward Vanessa, whispering something that made her laugh softly. The sound of that laughter shattered what little was left of Claire's composure. She bent her head, covering her face with her hand, her shoulders trembling as silent sobs racked her body. The gallery erupted again, reporters scribbling furiously, cameras flashing like lightning. To the world, Claire Bennett looked finished. And for a terrifying moment, she believed it. She felt herself slipping, falling into a pit of despair so deep she wondered if she would ever climb out. But just as she teetered on the edge of collapse, her gaze lifted, meeting the judge's eyes. For the briefest second, she saw not the stern figure of justice, but the quiet, protective gaze of a father. Claire thought she was utterly alone, but the truth staring back at her from the bench would soon change everything. Judge William Carter sat stiffly behind the bench, his robe heavy with the burden of duty. The courtroom saw him as a man of law, calm, impartial, detached. But beneath that exterior, a father's heart raged. Watching Claire tremble, seeing her shoulders shake as she tried to hide her tears, tore at him more than any gavel strike or courtroom outburst ever could. He couldn't rush to her side. He couldn't reveal the truth, not yet. Every eye in the room was watching, and one slip could end the case, destroy his credibility, and rob him of the very power he needed to protect her. But he couldn't sit idle either. He had to find a way to tell her, without words, that she was not alone. As Claire lifted her head, her red-rimmed eyes locking with his, William made his choice. It was the smallest of gestures, almost invisible to anyone else. He set his pen down softly, then adjusted the papers before him in a deliberate pattern, a signal only someone who knew him intimately could understand. Years ago, when Claire was just a little girl, struggling through spelling tests and math problems, he had used that same signal. A tap of the pen, a quiet adjustment of papers, and then a subtle nod. It meant, "I'm here. I see you. Don't give up." Now, across the chasm of years and the cold formality of the courtroom, he used it again. Claire's breath caught, her heart stumbled in her chest as the memory rushed back. She blinked, unsure if she had imagined it, but then his eyes softened, just for a fraction of a second. It was enough. Her despair eased, replaced by a fragile thread of hope. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel abandoned. She wasn't a broken wife, sitting alone against a merciless mistress and a cruel husband. She was a daughter, silently shielded by a father who still cared. Vanessa, oblivious, continued to smirk at the cameras. David leaned casually in his chair, smug in his belief that victory was certain. Neither of them noticed the silent exchange that had just passed, an exchange that would soon tip the scales of the trial. Claire straightened slightly, wiping the tears from her cheek. Her attorney glanced at her, surprised to see a flicker of strength returning to her posture. She whispered, "We keep fighting." Across the bench, William's jaw tightened. He couldn't embrace her, couldn't say the words she needed to hear, but his resolve solidified. If Vanessa and David thought they could crush his daughter so easily, they were gravely mistaken. Justice was coming, and he would deliver it with precision. The mistress thought her slap had broken Claire forever, but what she didn't know was that a father's silent promise had just reignited his daughter's will to fight. The courtroom settled once more, but the undercurrent of tension was thicker than ever. Reporters leaned forward in their seats, pens ready, cameras still snapping at every flicker of emotion on Claire's face. The slap had shifted the trial from legal proceedings into a public circus. Yet behind the noise, something else was brewing, evidence that neither David Carter nor Vanessa Monroe had anticipated. Claire's attorney rose, adjusting his tie with a calm confidence that contrasted sharply with the smug arrogance radiating from David's side of the courtroom. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady, "we would like to present new documentation regarding financial discrepancies tied to Mr. Carter's accounts." The gallery murmured. David's attorney stiffened. Vanessa frowned, her smirk faltering just slightly. The first set of exhibits displayed wire transfers. Large sums of money moved into offshore accounts under shell company names. Claire's attorney continued. These funds were withdrawn during the course of the marriage, without Mrs. Bennet's knowledge. We believe they were used to finance Mr. Carter's extramarital lifestyle. A ripple of shock ran through the gallery. Journalists scribbled furiously. David shifted in his seat, his composure cracking. That's ridiculous, he snapped. Business investments, that's all. But the attorney wasn't finished. He pulled out a folder and laid down photographs, images of David and Vanessa entering luxury resorts, receipts for jewelry, private jet bookings, and spa treatments. Each document carried David's signature or credit card authorization. Claire sat still, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Every piece of evidence was another cut. But this time, it wasn't her bleeding. It was David. For the first time, she saw the smugness falter in his eyes. Vanessa leaned toward him, whispering furiously, her mask of confidence cracking under the weight of exposure. The gallery gasped louder with each photo displayed, the narrative shifting before everyone's eyes. Claire was no longer the pathetic, abandoned wife. They could all see now who had been deceived, who had been used, and who had been betrayed. The judge watched carefully, his gavel silent, but his presence commanding. William Carter's chest tightened with both pride and anger. Pride that his daughter's side was finally gaining ground. Anger that this truth had to be dragged out in such a public, humiliating way. David slammed his hand on the table. This is irrelevant. It has nothing to do with the divorce settlement. His voice cracked, desperation leaking through the cracks in his once perfect image. The attorney didn't flinch. On the contrary, Mr. Carter, it has everything to do with it. These documents show a deliberate attempt to hide assets, deceive your wife, and squander marital funds on your mistress. The court has the right to know the truth. The gallery erupted again, the scandal spiraling out of David and Vanessa's control. And as the evidence piled higher, Vanessa's face paled. For the first time, the woman who thrived on cruelty looked uncertain. What neither David nor Vanessa knew was that the most damning piece of evidence had yet to be revealed, and it would strike harder than any slap ever could. Claire Bennett sat in silence as the evidence unfolded, each photograph and receipt landing like stones on the coffin of David and Vanessa's lies. Hours earlier, she had been trembling, broken under the weight of humiliation, believing her life was over. But now, as she watched David squirm and Vanessa whisper furiously, something inside her began to shift. The humiliation of the slap still burned on her cheek, but the sting no longer felt like defeat. Instead, it was fuel. The tears she had shed in silence were drying, replaced with something steadier, something stronger. For the first time in months, Claire felt a spark of power in her chest. She thought of her unborn child. She thought of the nursery waiting for a future that David had tried to steal. She thought of every cruel laugh, every mocking glance Vanessa had thrown at her. Every night she had cried alone while the world believed she was weak. And she realized she was not powerless. She had survived all of it. She was still standing. Slowly, Claire straightened in her chair. Her hands no longer trembled, her breathing calmed. Her attorney paused mid-sentence as he noticed the subtle transformation, giving her a small nod of encouragement. The cameras caught it too. The woman who had entered the courtroom, defeated, now looked different. Her posture was firm, her chin lifted. There was no arrogance in her expression, only quiet strength. The gallery sensed the change. The whispers softened, replaced by curious stares. Was this the same woman they had seen collapse in tears? Claire's presence shifted the air itself, as if the tide of the trial had begun to turn in her favor. Vanessa noticed it too. She leaned forward, narrowing her eyes at Claire. "Don't think this changes anything," she hissed across the aisle. But her words lacked the sharp confidence they once carried. Claire didn't flinch. She simply looked back at Vanessa, her eyes calm, steady, and unyielding. It wasn't anger she radiated, it was resolve. A resolve that terrified Vanessa more than rage ever could. David tried to reassert himself, clearing his throat and whispering loudly to his attorney, but his voice cracked. For the first time, he looked uncertain, glancing between Claire and the evidence piling against him. The control he thought he owned was slipping through his fingers. Claire touched her stomach again, not in fear this time, but in reassurance. She wasn't just protecting her baby anymore. She was fighting for both of them, and she wasn't afraid to be seen doing it. The cameras captured the transformation. By evening, her image would flood headlines not as a victim, but as a woman who had risen from humiliation to strength. And while David and Vanessa still believed they could crush her spirit, they had no idea that Claire's fight was only just beginning. And the next strike would not come from her, but from the very bench they underestimated. The courtroom was no longer on David Carter's side. What had started as his confident march toward victory was crumbling piece by piece. The financial records had painted him as a man who bled money into luxury escapes, all while his pregnant wife suffered in silence. The gallery no longer whispered with pity for David. They murmured with outrage. And Vanessa Monroe, once triumphant, now shifted uncomfortably under the weight of stares that had turned sharp and judgmental. Claire's attorney wasn't done. He stepped forward again, his voice calm but commanding. "Your Honor, we now present corroborating testimony, witness statements confirming Mr. Carter's extramarital activities with Ms. Monroe." The bailiff distributed sworn affidavits. Gasps spread like wildfire as the details were read aloud. Hotel clerks who had checked David and Vanessa in under false names, waiters who had seen them dining intimately, even a chauffeur who drove them to secluded getaways. Each statement was a nail in the coffin of their denials. David slammed his fist on the table. "Lies. All of it. They're making this up for money." His voice cracked, desperation spilling into every word. But Vanessa's mask slipped further. Her jaw tightened, her lips pressed into a thin line. She leaned close to David, hissing through clenched teeth, "I told you we should have covered this better." The microphones caught it. The gallery erupted. Reporters scrambled to jot the quote down, their pens scratching like wildfire across their pads. Cameras zoomed in on Vanessa's pale face, her arrogance stripped bare. Claire sat quietly, her strength steady, her eyes fixed forward. For months, she had been painted as the weak one, the abandoned wife. Now, the roles were reversed. It was David and Vanessa squirming under the lights, exposed for what they truly were. Her attorney laid the final blow for that day's testimony, a series of text messages obtained from David's second phone. They were projected onto the screen for the entire courtroom to see. "She'll never see it coming. Don't worry, the money's hidden. By the time she realizes, it'll be ours. Once the baby is born, I'll make sure she's out of the picture for good." The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Claire's breath caught in her throat, her hand instinctively clutching her stomach again. The gallery gasped in horror. Even the reporters looked shaken, their pens momentarily stilled. The judge's gavel pounded. "Order in the court." But the damage was done. The entire room now saw David not as a husband wronged, but as a predator plotting to strip his wife and child of security, dignity, and love. David's face turned crimson. Vanessa looked as though the floor had dropped beneath her feet. For the first time, their confidence shattered completely. And while they struggled to recover, they didn't realize that the most devastating revelation had yet to come. One that would destroy not only their lives, but their very sense of power. The courtroom was no longer just a place of law. It had become an arena of scandal. The walls seemed to shake with the noise of outrage, shock, and disbelief as the text messages glowed across the projector screen. Words that revealed cruelty and malice now echoed in the minds of everyone present. "Once the baby is born, I'll make sure she's out of the picture for good." The gallery erupted. Some gasped loudly, others covered their mouths in horror. A woman in the back row whispered, "She's pregnant, and he wanted to erase her?" A man muttered angrily, "That's not just betrayal, that's inhuman." Reporters scribbled furiously, already drafting headlines that would shake the city by evening. Camera shutters clicked non-stop, capturing David's flushed face and Vanessa's pale, frozen expression. The scandal was no longer a private wound. It was public property, and the court of public opinion had already begun its ruthless judgment. Claire Bennett sat silently, but her silence no longer looked like weakness. It looked like strength. Every eye turned toward her, no longer with pity, but with admiration. She was the wronged wife, the expectant mother betrayed and plotted against, yet still standing with dignity. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't lashed out. She didn't need to. The truth was speaking louder than anything she could ever say. Vanessa shifted in her chair, panic flashing across her face. She tried to whisper excuses to David's attorney, but her voice trembled. For the first time, she was no longer in control. The smirk that had once defined her had vanished, replaced by the unmistakable shadow of fear. David, however, tried to fight back. He slammed his hands on the table and shouted, "These are taken out of context. It's a setup. Claire is trying to destroy me." But his words rang hollow. The gallery laughed bitterly, and someone muttered, "He's finished." Even the judge's gavel couldn't silence the murmurs that swirled like a storm. William Carter pounded the bench, his voice booming, "Order! Order in the court!" Slowly, the room quieted, but the shift in energy remained. The tide had turned. Claire's attorney leaned toward her, whispering, "They've lost the crowd. That's more powerful than any evidence." Claire gave the faintest nod, her hand resting gently on her stomach. For the first time, she felt the world wasn't against her. It was standing with her. Outside the courthouse, news vans waited, ready to broadcast every detail. Inside, strangers who had once stared with judgment now glared at David and Vanessa with disgust. In a single afternoon, their public image had shattered beyond repair. But as devastating as this exposure was, the trial was not yet over. There were still truths hidden, secrets waiting to be revealed. And the most dangerous one was sitting silently on the judge's bench, cloaked in black robes. The courtroom believed the scandal had reached its peak, but the revelation of blood ties between the judge and the woman on trial would send shockwaves no one was prepared for. The courtroom air was thick, heavy with the weight of betrayal and the raw sting of truth. For hours, evidence had dismantled David Carter's carefully built facade, and Vanessa Monroe's arrogance had melted into desperation. The gallery had turned against them, but still, they clung to denial. David shouted objections, Vanessa whispered excuses, their attorney scrambling like a man drowning. At the bench, Judge William Carter could no longer remain just a judge. He had endured silently, watching his daughter slapped, mocked, and humiliated. He had buried his fury beneath the black robe, clenching his fists until his knuckles turned white. But the moment had come when silence was no longer justice. He lifted the documents before him, Claire's financial exhibits, the text messages, the testimonies. His gavel struck once, the sound commanding absolute silence. "This court," his voice boomed, "has seen evidence not of a marriage gone sour, but of calculated deception, financial manipulation, and cruelty beyond measure." The gallery leaned forward, breathless. Claire froze, her heart pounding. His tone was not the cold detachment of a judge. It carried the fire of something deeper. David rose to his feet, pointing toward the bench. "You can't speak to me like this. This trial is biased. This whole thing is a setup." William's gaze locked on him, steady and unyielding. "Biased?" His voice dropped lower, sharper. "You struck at a woman carrying your child. You plotted to strip her of dignity and security. You stood by while your mistress assaulted her in open court, and now you accuse this process of bias?" The gallery erupted with gasps and murmurs. Reporters scribbled furiously, sensing something monumental unfolding. Vanessa tugged at David's sleeve, panic flashing in her eyes. William leaned forward, his voice resonant. "You forget yourself, Mr. Carter. You forget that justice does not bend to arrogance. And you forget." He paused, his eyes flicking briefly to Claire. For the first time his mask slipped, and the truth shimmered in the air. "You forget that every action has consequences." Claire's breath caught. It wasn't a confession, not yet, but it was the closest he had ever come to acknowledging their bond. Her chest tightened, tears pricking her eyes, not from despair, but from a fragile hope she had thought long dead. David sputtered, "This is outrageous. I demand a mistrial." But his voice cracked, and his words carried no weight. The judge's gavel slammed down again, louder this time. "You will sit down, Mr. Carter, or you will be held in contempt of court." The power in his tone silenced even the boldest whispers in the gallery. Claire felt it, the shift. For the first time, the courtroom wasn't just watching her humiliation. They were watching justice gather like a storm, and it was aimed squarely at David and Vanessa. But the storm was far from over, because the moment the truth of the judge's bloodline was spoken aloud, the scandal would explode beyond anything the courtroom had ever seen. The silence that followed Judge William Carter's booming words was deafening. The gavel still vibrated from his strike, echoing like thunder through the chamber. David Carter, once smug and untouchable, now stood pale and furious, his carefully polished mask shattered. Vanessa Monroe sat beside him, her face drained of its former arrogance, her eyes darting like a cornered animal searching for escape. Claire Bennett remained seated, calm now, her posture straight, her eyes fixed forward. The tide had turned completely. She no longer felt the crushing weight of humiliation pressing on her chest. Instead, she felt the quiet strength of justice wrapping around her like armor. Her attorney rose, his voice steady but sharp. "Your Honor, given the evidence presented, financial fraud, reckless endangerment, and blatant abuse, we move to dismiss all of Mr. Carter's claims and request full protection for Mrs. Bennett and her unborn child." The gallery gasped. The request was bold, but it was backed by truth. The mountain of evidence, the testimonies, the damning text messages, it was undeniable. David had not only betrayed his wife, he had tried to strip her of everything, even her future as a mother. David's attorney scrambled, his words tumbling out in panic. "Your Honor, surely we can negotiate." But William's gavel cut him off. "Enough. This court will not be manipulated with half-truths and excuses." His voice carried the weight of finality. David lost control. He slammed his hands on the table, shouting, "You can't do this. I built everything. She was nothing before me." His voice cracked with desperation, his arrogance unraveling into madness. The gallery erupted in outrage. "Monster," someone shouted. Another voice cried, "She deserves better." The wave of public opinion crashed down harder than any gavel strike could. Vanessa, realizing the ship was sinking, turned on David. "This is your fault," she hissed, her voice sharp enough to cut. "You promised me she'd be gone, that we'd have everything. Now look at us." Their perfect alliance dissolved into chaos before the eyes of the world. Cameras captured every word, every desperate gesture, every ounce of venom they spewed at one another. The glamorous mistress and the powerful husband were no longer feared. They were pitied, mocked, despised. Judge Carter stood tall. "This court finds that Mr. Carter's actions constitute financial misconduct, emotional cruelty, and gross neglect of his duties as a husband and father. Assets will be frozen, and Mrs. Bennett will retain full protection under the law." His gavel came down with finality. The gallery erupted in applause, something rarely heard in a courtroom. Claire's eyes welled with tears, not of pain this time, but of relief. For the first time in months, she could breathe. David collapsed into his chair, his face buried in his hands. Vanessa turned away from him, her head lowered, her victory spoiled, her reputation destroyed. They had plotted to ruin Claire, but instead they had ruined themselves. Yet just as the courtroom believed the drama had reached its conclusion, the truth of blood and family, long hidden, was about to surface. And it would shake every soul in the room. The gavel's final strike still echoed when the courtroom fell into stunned silence. David Carter sat defeated, his empire crumbling. Vanessa Monroe, once smug and untouchable, now shrank under the weight of her own exposure. The gallery buzzed with whispers of scandal and justice. But amid the chaos, one truth had yet to surface. The truth Judge William Carter could no longer keep hidden. He removed his glasses and set them down carefully. His eyes lingered on Claire, and for the first time, he allowed the mask of impartiality to slip. His voice, deep and steady, carried not only authority but something far more personal. "Before we conclude, there is one matter that must be spoken. Mrs. Bennett is not only a party in this case, she is my daughter." The words hit the courtroom like lightning. Gasps erupted. Reporters scrambled, their pens racing to capture the revelation. Claire's breath caught in her throat, her eyes widening as tears welled. For years, she had lived with the quiet ache of distance, believing her father had abandoned her. And now, in the most public moment of her life, he had claimed her before the world. William's gaze softened, his voice cracking ever so slightly. "Claire, I may have failed you in the past, but I will not fail you now. This court stands not only for the law, but for justice, and justice has been served." Claire's tears spilled freely, but they were not tears of humiliation this time. They were tears of release, tears of finally being seen, not as a broken wife, but as a daughter, a mother, and a woman who had endured and survived. The gallery, once divided, now broke into applause. Strangers wiped their eyes, touched by the sight of a father and daughter silently reconciling under the weight of justice. The cameras caught every angle, every tear, every flicker of dignity restored. David and Vanessa sat frozen, stripped of power, their legacy reduced to ash. They had plotted to destroy Claire, but in the end, they had exposed themselves and elevated the very woman they sought to ruin. Claire rose slowly, her attorney steadying her. She placed a hand on her stomach and looked toward her father. Their eyes met, and though no words passed between them, the bond was undeniable. She was not alone. She never would be again. As she walked out of the courtroom, cameras flashing around her, she no longer felt like a victim. She felt like a survivor, a mother, and a woman ready to rebuild. The scandal had not destroyed her, it had reborn her. Outside, the crowd parted, not to jeer or pity but to admire. Claire Bennett, once humiliated, now stood as a symbol of strength. Her story was no longer one of betrayal, but of justice, resilience, and the unbreakable bond of family, a story the world would never forget. So my friends, here we are. The story has come to a close. If you've stayed with me until now, it means something in this journey touched your heart. Maybe it reminded you of your own struggles, maybe it stirred memories of pain, or maybe it lit a spark of courage deep inside. And that's the beauty of stories. They heal us. They remind us that we are not alone. Claire's journey teaches us that even in the darkest betrayal, we can rise. As the Stoics remind us, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Marcus Aurelius wrote those words centuries ago, yet they speak directly to what Claire discovered. She couldn't control David's cruelty or Vanessa's arrogance, but she could control her dignity, her resolve, her love for her child. And that's what saved her. Seneca once said, "Sometimes even to live is an act of courage." Isn't that the truth? Claire lived through shame, heartbreak, and humiliation, yet every tear she shed carried her closer to transformation. She didn't crumble. She endured. And in the end, endurance became her victory. So let's take this lesson with us. When life slaps us down, sometimes literally, we still have the choice to rise, to protect what matters, to find strength where we thought none existed. Healing doesn't mean forgetting the pain. It means refusing to let pain define us. If this story touched you, share it with someone who might need the reminder. Like this video, subscribe to our channel, and let's keep building a community where stories lift us up and remind us of our own strength. Because just like Claire, you too can rise from whatever tries to break you. And when you do, the world will see not your scars, but your courage.